On Tuesday, President Trump delivered his first official State of the Union address, and I'd like to give you the right-angle State of the Union because, well, why not? It'll be fun. We tried doing this with Obama. That was no fun at all. I think things are a lot different now with President Trump. I'm Steve Green along with Bill Whittle and Scott Ott, and this is, as I said, Right Angle, brought to you by the members of BillWhittle.com. So let's just keep this intro short. Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States, Scott Ott.
You know, I troubled myself this morning to read George Washington's first State of the Union address, so to speak, and also Abraham Lincoln's. I didn't get all the way through Lincoln's. His was much longer. Washington's was rather succinct. But then I went back and read the U.S. Constitution and Article 2, Section 3, if I'm not mistaken, that says that the president shall, from time to time, basically make a report to the legislative branch of the State of the Union and recommend anything that he thinks would be salutary thereto. And I'm loosely paraphrasing. So basically, the idea of the State of the Union address is not that the president puts on a sideshow or a campaign speech or tries to rally his base or tries to unite the country or anything like that. But the whole idea of the State of the Union address is that the executive, who at that time was the only one who was really on the job all the time, because the legislature would only come in from time to time. That's why the Constitution originally mandated that the legislature, the Congress, needed to assemble at least once a year on the first Monday in December, I believe was the date. So, because it was not expected that they would be all that clued into what was going on. They would be in their home districts most of the time. The president was supposed to say, okay, here's what's going on. I think it would be a good idea if we took these actions. We could use some legislation to do this, blah, blah, blah. These are my suggestions. And then the legislature could do whatever they wanted. So my ideal State of the Union address would actually not be in person at all. It would be submitted on paper. It would be sent over from the executive branch with great respect to the Speaker of the House and said, please, accept these, my perception of how things are going right now and what might be useful for you. I do not want to intrude upon your hall. I don't think the Sergeant at Arms of the House should ever stand up and say, Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States. I don't think he should be in that room. I think that there should be a separation of powers. I think there should be checks and balances. I've got this crazy notion. I think I'll write it down when in the course of human events I get a chance to do so.
Yeah, I was reading a Twitter thread from Jay Cost earlier from the Weekly Standard, and Jay and Scott are the two guys who know the Constitution better than anybody else that I know personally or kind of personally. He was making the point that between Jefferson and Wilson, the State of the Union was delivered exactly as Scott said. Wilson had to make it all about him, so he returned to this speech and tried to bend Congress to his will. So speaking of bending Congress to his will, Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States, Bill Whittle.
At this point, you hear the soundtrack from Cleopatra, the 1964 classic with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. And at this point, as you look to the side of the building, the president is borne in on a litter by and palm branches are waved upon him, and he's wearing the eye makeup, like
You're
this,
not
like
a
the
man,
Egyptians.
you're a god.
That the Egyptians. That's right. And behind me is a Democrat saying, "You're not a man, you're a god,
Mortal."
That's right. And then I will say, off with their heads, and off we go. I really like what Scott had to say, and I was going to point out, as he already did, that for most of the history of the Republic, the State of the Union was given by a secretary. Lincoln's State of the Unions were all read to the Congress by his secretary, who took them over and simply said, here's what's going on, and it wasn't showboating or grandstanding or politicking or anything else. What I think would be an interesting thing to do would be to have the President of the United States give a State of the Union that was exactly that. Wouldn't that get people's attention? Wouldn't that get people's attention if the president were to just come in and say, members of Congress, esteemed my fellow Americans? The last year, we spent $3.6 trillion. We took in $2.4 trillion for a $1.4 trillion deficit. That is a significant increase and so on. Our education department spent this much money. They're asking for an increase of this, but test scores over the last year have gone down by this much percentage and so on. And basically just simply list everything that the government does on a large scale, not every little thing, but list the basic economic and performance standards of the various parts of the government, and then simply say, it is my recommendation based upon this information that we do the following. And he doesn't have the power to dictate law. He says, education department's not feeling, I suggest we do this. No, we don't suggest we do that. Not a word about politics, no pointing to people in the gallery, nothing. It is the State of the Union, and here you go. And the reason I think that would be so powerful is because it would give people an idea, first of all, of what the job of the president is and just how far away from it we've gotten. And furthermore, it would be an indication, I think, that somebody is serious about the actual operation of the government rather than what the government appears to look like from the outside. You know, when you don't have budgets anymore and you just have a series of continuing resolutions and every single constitutional law is either openly or quietly broken or so on, I would simply say, do precisely what it calls for in the Constitution and do not do a comma more than that. And I live in the 21st century, and I consider myself to be a messaging guy. So I'm telling you that if you were to come out in the 21st century, I'm telling you as a messaging person, I think, you would have the most spectacular effect on this 21st century electorate if you simply did the job that was outlined for you back in the late 1700s.
You know, Bill, it's a radical suggestion that you think the chief executive of this republic should act like the chief executive of a republic instead of like a king.
That's why it's so shocking, and that's why it's so shocking and new.
Yeah. Well, okay. You know what? I can keep mine very short. So, Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States, Steve Green, and here's all I would have to say. I'm going to take a little bit from Bill and a little bit from Scott and kind of put it together into one very short address, which would be this. The State of the Union is pretty good, but it would be a lot better if you hadn't turned so much over to the executives. So if you lousy bastards would get off your asses and do your job, the State of the Union would be a whole lot stronger. Thank you. Good night. God bless the United States of America.
You wouldn't even have a chance to be slightly buzzed on something like that, Steve.
Nope.